Hey everyone, welcome to our video on one of the coolest forgotten battles in Asian colonial history. When the Dutch kicked the Spanish out of Taiwan in the 1600s.
Yeah, that actually happened. Taiwan wasn't always just stuck between China and Japan. In the early 1600s, it was the battleground for two European colonial powers trying to flex in Asia.
So grab a snack, sit back, and let's dive into this chill little slice of history.
So, let's rewind to the early 1600s. Europe was in full-on global exploration and colonization mode. Spain and Portugal had already carved up the world between themselves in the 1500s. But then the Dutch came along like, hey, we want a piece of that too. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, was basically the Amazon of the 1600s. Huge, rich and ambitious. They were setting up trading posts all over Asia, from Indonesia to Japan. Taiwan, back then, wasn't really under any centralized rule. Indigenous people lived on the island, and Chinese settlers were starting to arrive. But there wasn't a strong government, so it looked like a perfect spot to grab.
In 1624, the Dutch landed on the southwestern part of Taiwan and built Fort Zeelandia. They used it as their base for trade with China and Japan. But here's the twist. Just a year later, in 1626, the Spanish showed up in the north of Taiwan and were like, surprise, we're taking this too. They set up their own forts in Keelung and Tamsui, calling the area Formosa. Spain wanted to stop Dutch influence and protect their trade routes with the Philippines, which they already controlled. So now you've got both the Dutch and the Spanish chilling on the same island, but you know that wasn't going to last.
Part 2. The build-up to the conflict. So at first it wasn't a full-on war. Both sides were kinda just building their forts, trading, and low-key spying on each other. The Dutch had better ships and more resources. The Spanish, meanwhile, were already struggling to hold their forts. Keelung in particular had supply issues, not enough food, people, or backup from their main base in Manila. Meanwhile, the Dutch were getting stronger. Fort Zeelandia became a solid base, and the VOC started expanding trade, even working with the local indigenous groups and bringing in Chinese settlers for farming and trade.
But the Dutch were not just gonna sit there and share the island. Over time, they started thinking, you know what? We could totally take over the north. By the late 1630s, Spain's presence in Taiwan was seriously weakened. Their garrisons were small, underfunded, and basically just waiting for something bad to happen. And then in 1641, the Dutch tried to take Keelung for the first time, but they failed. The Spanish held them off for now. Fast forward to 1642, the Dutch had regrouped and were ready for another attack. This time they brought a bigger force, 4 warships and hundreds of soldiers. They went straight for Keelung. The Spanish had around 60 soldiers and some native allies, but they were heavily outnumbered and outgunned. The siege didn't last very long. After bombarding the fort with cannon fire, the Dutch stormed it. The Spanish tried to hold on, but they eventually surrendered. They knew there was no backup coming from the Philippines. With that, the Dutch took over Keelung, and just like that, the Spanish era in Taiwan was over. They packed up and left Taiwan for good. The Dutch now controlled almost the entire island.
Part 4. What happened after? So, what did the Dutch do with Taiwan? Well, they ruled it for almost 40 years, from 1624 until 1662. During that time, they set up schools, churches, taxed local farmers, and expanded trade with China and Japan. But things weren't all smooth. Indigenous resistance was common, and there were constant conflicts with the Chinese settlers too. Eventually, the Dutch got kicked out by Kochinga, a Ming loyalist from China. He sailed over in 1661 with thousands of troops and captured Fort Zeelandia after a long siege that ended Dutch rule in Taiwan. But that's a story for another time. Part 5. Why this matters. So why should you care about this random 1600s battle? Well, first, it's just wild to think that the two European powers fought over Taiwan centuries ago. Most people don't know Taiwan was once part of this global game of colonial chess. Second, it shows how Taiwan's strategic location made it valuable to outsiders, a theme that still exists today. And finally, it's just a cool David vs Goliath story in reverse. The Dutch, a small country back home, going head to head with the mighty Spanish Empire and winning. So, thank you for watching and see you next time.